Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to my monthly webinar, start of every month normally. And here we are in March already. And we've got a few hundred of you signed in for this. And this, where did this idea come from? I tend to write these webinars from what I find either out there in education or in practice. And this has been a sort of a trend we've been noticing over a recent time. I'm not sure it's a trend related to a change, like many things in our practice. A lot of it probably is a trend due to us actually noticing stuff. Often, things have been going on for a long time, and that's only when we start to look that we find things. Otherwise, we'd never know. So tonight's talk is relating to cardiac arrest rhythms, shockable or non-shockable. How hard can it be? Sounds remarkably easy. Well, we shall see. Let's tick on the right thing, and then we should be able to scroll down. So, what's the issue? Let me move some screens around here so I can see the notes. Definitely hear a lot of anecdotal stories of pre-hospital failed shocks across the UK in adults and pediatrics. Occasionally that manifests itself in a HCPC case, which is accessible. And I went looking for some more. I haven't put any cases up here because obviously, you don't reflect anything on individuals when the problem is, as ever, system related. But a quick Google search, if the subject interests you, will turn up lots of ambulance service internal reports, coroners preventing future death rulings, and many other articles from across the UK. So I think we can say it's a fairly universal idea. That's where the idea came from. So surely this should be, a core skill for pre-hospital clinicians. Certainly at ALS level, it has been historically, isn't it? But even at ILS level, ambulance technician AAP level, and definitely at paramedic level, historically they've all been taught manual recognition of cardiac arrest rhythms by visual representation from the monitor screen, and then making an appropriate decision based on their knowledge or the knowledge of the team if there's more than one provider there trained in that skill. So that's been a sort of a core of training for quite a long time. Back from when there was only manual defibrillators, then into the very early AEDs, and then a larger use of AEDs for a while, then back to manual defibrillation for a reason we'll discuss in a minute. So, and where did the idea of the study bit came from? Because that certainly became of interest. So I noted this paper, and the link's there at the bottom. It was an EMJ paper that looked at a simulated rhythm recognition test. So many of you were sent it a week or so ago to take part. And I think we had about 174 people submitted their results, which was great. Many thanks for that. And hopefully found it quite educational. I did when I tried it a few months ago when I came across the paper. And for this piece of research, they created this bit of software, SimulShock. And for those that didn't take part, what it did was it showed you lots of rhythm strips, and it asked you to determine whether they were shockable or non-shockable. So there was 2 buttons to press. You had to pick shockable or non-shockable, and then it also timed how long it took you to make that decision. So it scored you whether you got it right, and also about whether how long it took you to make the decision. And it assumed that nothing had a pulse. So everything was only going to be either a shockable or non-shockable rhythm. So it was quite an interesting little study, and we're going to talk about a bit more. Sample size is quite small, so really not reflective, of data as such. But it was interesting to see the results that came in. And obviously it was honesty based, so people could have written what they wanted. But when I was looking through the results, it seemed pretty consistent. So I think we got some good data. So many thanks to everyone for taking part in that. So what did we find? Well, this is our results from the 135 we got there, 135 completed responses. So this is non-audited. It was an honesty poll. You know, people got to do the test, and then when they got the results at the end, they got to tap the numbers into a little data collection portal, and that brought us this stuff. And I think someone's asking the question there, is the test still active? Yes, because it's not our test. So if you hunt for simul shock, you'll find it immediately on Google, and you can take part and score yourself. So yes, the test is not, was built for that trial, and they left it running for people to use. What did we find in our data? So our global sensitivity of shockable versus non-shockable, how good people were at getting the right answer overall, was about 0.89. Specificity about 0.84. So whether they it measures that by those that didn't shock a non-shockable rhythm. So how many times they got it wrong where it would have mattered. And then the individual rhythms it looked at. So a very clear course sort of VF was about 0.98. So people got it right 98% of the time. And for VT, ventricular tachycardia, because it assumed everything, nothing had a pulse, that was a shockable rhythm, also 0.98. So people were very good at recognizing that. But when it came to a lower amplitude VF, defined in there as fine VF, and I'll say that in a small bit of 6 come up, as we'll discuss why in a bit, then sensitivity was much lower. So, you know, less than 75% of those were correct. Of course, there's a certain amount of bias in this as well. Of people that were sent the test, maybe only those that felt confident in doing the test took part, and maybe only those that got decent results submitted them. So we don't know. It's purely an honesty-based poll. But interesting when we get to the next slide. So these are the results from the EMJ paper, and this trial was carried out on pre-hospital physicians based in France. So that'd be part of SAMU, their national pre-hospital critical care service, a government-ran, usually doctor, nurse, critical care response unit, mostly ground-based, regional. This was the outcome of their study. So they had 215 replies, so a little bit more than us, but not a huge amount. And they analysed results for 190 physicians. In their study, they also asked them if they preferred manual defibrillation, and 57% said yes, which isn't as high as I thought it would probably be. So that's interesting in itself, that, you know, many people decided that an automated thing may be of benefit to them. So their sensitivity for shockable rhythm was about 0.91 and non-shockable about 0.91. But for the VT and course VF, they're both 1, so they got those right 100% of the time, but got some of the others wrong. And fine VF was only 0.6, so lower than our score that we got from our small poll. So yeah, the outcome of the paper really shows that people are sometimes poor at recognizing rhythms. Only 83% of the time did they not shock a PEA, and 93% of the time not shock a systole. And the speed of decision making is of interest as well. VT an average of 2 seconds, course VF 2.1, a systole 2.4, PEA 2.8, so longer, and that probably is reflective of the multivariate nature of PEA and having to go, or I'm trying to see some regularity in it before we can declare it's you know, not a random rhythm, and certainly a longer time for those labeled as fine VF as well, as people looked at it a little bit harder before they made the decision. So definitely, I think overall quite reflective of our results. Ours were, you know, not a million miles away from that. So I think that's quite interesting. So, you know, how have we ended up where we are? The sort of manual defibrillation versus AED and why. So as times have changed, obviously the Resource Council now dictates that you know, there should be no more than a 10-second maximum gap in chest compressions to allow us to do rhythm recognition and anything else we want to do. But certainly in practice and in the education that I lead on this, we really try and stick to, 5 seconds maximum in a well-organized team. That's perfectly achievable. So, and the older ADs and AD models couldn't do that at all. We know the older ADs were very slow. And just to make sure they were 100% right, they used to generally analyze twice. So they'd do a full analysis of the rhythm, and then they'd do analysis of the rhythm again. Any sort of movement artifact or anything like that would cause it to dump and recycle. And then it was charge, and the charging technology wasn't that great. So that took quite a while as well. And it was quite common to have sort of pauses of 20 seconds plus on automated machines. And while those automated machines were being used by, as a whole, non-clinicians in the sort of early days of, AEDs in the community, etc., then clearly, that's acceptable because, the delivery of early defibrillation is one of the very few things, proven in resuscitation science. So if it needed the machine to be relatively slow to do that reliably, then delivering that defibrillation is always going to be faster than the arrival of someone else with a defibrillator, possibly from the ambulance service. So that seemed acceptable. But for our purposes, arriving on scene, as a healthcare deliverer, that seemed incredibly slow. While you just sat and watched. Of course, you couldn't do, as it's an AED, for most of them, you couldn't do CPR while it was thinking because that counts that as movement artifact and dumps. So you couldn't touch the patient for a considerable length of time. So it led to very long delays in CPR. So we moved, away really to manual defibrillation from the early machines that were capable of both, and taught people rhythm recognition in order to, reduce the time. We're going to talk about how that's probably changed over time. That's probably how we ended up sort of with manual rhythm recognition that we've, as a whole, until relatively recently, stuck with. So what choice are we making? I think this is where some of the problems start to exist. This is what we're going to sort of get into, as to, where the problems come from. In reality, the decision we're making is whether this rhythm is shockable or non-shockable. Although often in settings in education, people look at the screen and go, oh, that's a systole, that's PA, that's VF, whatever. But that isn't actually what the algorithm says, is it? The algorithm defines shockable or non-shockable. So actually, that's the practical decision we're making. We've got to recognize the rhythm and then decide which group it's in. Is it in the shockable group or the non-shockable group? So we can pick the right algorithm. Now, interestingly, because there's no algorithm for the individual rhythms apart from that, in the Resus Council algorithm. Interestingly, most modern AEDs will shock VT without being able to do a pulse check if it's over a certain rate. So I think most of them are set around the 150 sort of mark. So if it's a VT over 150, it will probably shock it. Because it can't do a pulse check or rely on someone to do a pulse check. So it just goes ahead and delivers a shock on the basis that's probably going to be needed. So what are our problematic rhythms? And these clearly are library images, and that's going to be part of the problem. And all of these book rhythms are problematic. Our VF, our VT, our systole, and if you can see what I've done there, our PEA. Now, just though it might be, the reason I put that in there instead of a rhythm is, of course, you can't have a rhythm that represents PEA because it can be lots of different rhythms that don't have a pulse. So by putting a slide or a book that contains one rhythm with a picture that says PEA, that sort of creates a mindset that that's what PEA looks like, and that might be a problem in itself. So there's problems with the recognition of all these rhythms, as we're going to talk about now. So starting with VF, I think someone's already alluded to it in the questions there about fine VF, and is there much benefit in using ultrasound to check that, and so on. So one of the problems is how we define it. And we see people go, oh, that's coarse VF, that's fine VF. and I don't like those terms because there is no, massive definition that we can use. There can be a lower amplitude VF, definitely. But, when you look up the book definition, it says that fine VF is low amplitude less than 3 millimeters, and the rest of VF is greater than 3 millimeters. Well, that's great. So, while the patient's lying there in cardiac arrest, I'll get my ruler out. Obviously, we all carry a ruler. And, I'll do some very quick measuring on the monitor screen to determine whether this is, what is a book fine VF. So that's not very helpful, is it at all? And if you look into the algorithms about fine VF, the ELCE guideline said there's, where there is doubt whether the system is assisted or extremely fine VF. So we've just got a fine VF now. We've now got an extremely fine VF. Do not attempt defibrillation. Let's say continue chest compressions and ventilation. We wish to clarify that when the room is clearly judged to be a VF, a shock should be given. Now, to me, that is utter bunkum. That is as clear as mud. So if it's extremely fine VF is okay, but extremely fine VF, don't shock it. But if it's a VF, shock it. Yeah, so, that is obviously very helpful indeed. Yeah, and I think that's where some of the confusion comes from. People are really unclear, whether they should shock these low amplitude VFs or not. Yeah, because the guidelines are very, very unclear. So what is our definition? Yeah, you can't just, it's like these terms have been made up. Fine VF, very fine VF, extremely fine VF. Yeah, I'm going to need a more accurate ruler, it seems. So yeah, and these low amplitude VFs can be quite difficult to see, particularly on the screen. If you haven't got the screen too closely, you've placed the monitor in a place you can't see it properly. Yeah, then it's not unheard of for these to be defined as a systole, and then someone looks more closely and go, no, I don't think that is. Yeah, although when we run simulations with students, if someone declares fine VF, I always ask them what the fine VF algorithm is, and they look very confused. Yeah, because it's either shockable or non-shockable. So in the pre-hospital perspective, what does JLCalc say? Well, JLCalc is a little bit clearer, and it says if it's a shockable rhythm, then shock it. Yeah, it's either shockable or non-shockable. Yeah, and if you believe it's shockable, then it should be shocked. And I think that's definitely a much clearer model than fine VF, very fine VF, extremely fine VF, all of which we've no idea what they are because even they don't define it in the guideline where they use those words. So that's probably the problem with VF currently, this idea about what is a VF, what isn't a VF. Yeah, I think that's really problematic. Onto VT, yeah, so, it's quite a rare rhythm. It's not something we see very often. How many of us have ever seen a patient in cardiac arrest in a non-simulated VT, which can, look very different and can be quite bizarre sometimes as well. And, we've got some different examples here, and it's like, is this VF? Is it VT? Is it the mysterious torsade de poids, rhythm? And you've got, up to 5 seconds paused. So you've got 2 to 2.5 seconds to make a decision and implement that decision. So CPR is recommenced in 5 seconds after you've pressed charge if you're in manual defibrillation mode, or fast enough to get the machine to charge to deliver a shock. Yeah, so I think that's also very problematic, rhythms that we just don't see that often. And then people are debating whether it's what it is and should they shock it or not, and so on. That probably doesn't help. PEA is also problematic. So of course, here is an example from a book. So it says PEA might be regular or irregular. It might be fast or slow. It might be narrow or wide. The P waves or peer interval may be visible or normal, including sinus and origin, and then it shows you a picture. And the picture obviously only represents one of those combinations. What it doesn't represent is all the other things that can be PEA, and that's also problematic, isn't it? And I think the question would be, given 5 seconds, which of these rhythms with no pulse is a PEA? Yeah, before you start looking too closely, remember, don't get confused. All these rhythms are a PEA if they've got no pulse. because there is organized electrical activity of some sort. Yeah, so these are all a PEA. The trouble is, when you put a PEA in a book, then then that's what people see. Yeah, and then when they don't see the one that's in the book, then they're not sure what it is, and that's clearly a problem, I think. And then asystole. Well, it depends which book you pick up. Sometimes it's a flat line, sometimes it's a wavy line. Yeah, sometimes a line with bumps in it. Yeah, and in many algorithms, including in JRCalc, a rhythm under 10 beats a minute is agonal and therefore treated as a systole. So that's a different definition of a systole again. It might be have an organized rhythm, but it's very, very slow and not likely to lead to anything useful. So that's also problematic as well, isn't it? So, systole isn't only one thing, it can be other things as well. And this is my favorite slide in the whole presentation. So who's to blame? Yeah, there's always someone to blame, isn't there? And we have to decide, where does this problem come from? How have we ended up at this place where we know in practice from the data we can find, coroner's rulings, etc., that people are not shockable rhythms? How has this happened? How have we got to this point? Oh, lost the mouse a second. Hold on. So, as an educationalist, then I always like to pass the first blame to myself. Yeah. So, most of the things that go on in practice are the result of education. People do what they've been taught. They do how they've been assessed. They do what it says in books. Yeah. And so much of that stuff is clearly wrong. Yeah. In scenario-based ILS and ALS training, people are commonly asked to name the rhythm rather than name the algorithm. Yeah, so they'll be, what's that rhythm? Oh, it's VF. Yeah. What's that rhythm? Oh, it's PA. Yeah, and there is no algorithm for those things directly. It's shockable or non-shockable. And if we use the term shockable or non-shockable, that defines your action because it defines which loop you're in. Yeah, otherwise you're having to make another decision. That's VF. That's a shockable rhythm. What's a shockable algorithm? And certainly when I've been running OOHCAs in places where students name the rhythm rather than the part of the algorithm they want to use, I've seen it where students will name the right rhythm and go down the wrong line of the algorithm. So I go, that's VF, carry on CPR. Yeah, rather than going, that's a shockable rhythm, that prompts you to shock. Yeah, in manual mode defibrillation. Yeah, so I think language in education and how we measure people and how we assess people is really, really important because we're setting people up for what happens in the real world. Simulators can also be an issue. I'm not linked to any particular brand because there's now loads of brands of monitor simulation boxes you can attach to defibrillators to make them simulate stuff. The problem is that many of them have only got one type of that rhythm. So there's only one VF, or sometimes there's 2 or 3 VFs, but the educator only ever picks the one VF, the one that comes up in the commonly used rhythm box. Yeah. There's maybe only one VT, and certainly one of the well-known ones doesn't have a selection of PEAs in it. Yeah, you have to just go randomly and find some other rhythm that looks regular and organized, and then change the rate, and then say there's no pulse. Which is what a PEA is. But of course, that drives people to do it the easy way. Yeah, so they'll, human nature tells us, whoever the tutor is will press the least amount of buttons to make something that could be a PEA. So maybe they just pick the same one every time. And if you've spent 3 years at university doing ALS scenarios and assessments, and have only ever seen one VF, one VT, and one PEA, then it's hardly a surprise that when you go into the real world and the patients haven't been to your university and learned what heart rhythm they should be in, then people don't recognize the rhythm that they're seeing. It doesn't look like the one they've looked at for 3 years. Yeah, and I think that's definitely an issue. And that's part of sort of, clinically unhelpful OOHCAs. What we want OOHCAs to do is to improve patients' chance of survival. Yeah, so, in many assessments, Failing to shock a shockable rhythm is a fail, and you can't disagree with that. If someone's in a shockable rhythm and you don't shock it, that's bad. That's bad form. I think we can all agree on that. But in many OOHCAs as well, if someone shocks an indeterminate rhythm because they're clearly not sure and they don't want to spend a long time looking at the rhythm, and that turns out to be a weird-looking PEA, would that be a fail? And I have a feeling in some institutions it might be. Yeah, OOHCAs can be, very black and white. This is a shockable rhythm OOHCA, you will shock it. This is a non-shockable rhythm OOHCA. If you shock it, you will fail. Now, I'm sure that doesn't happen everywhere, but I'm sure that does happen some places. And I think that's, going to be an issue. Because what that does, if you set standards like that, if you set an OOHCA, where it's one thing or the other, pass or fail, then that mindset transitions over into the real world. And students then become very, very cautious about delivering defibrillation, particularly if they once failed that OOHCA for that very thing. If they shocked a non-shockable rhythm and failed the OOHCA, then therefore a very long time, they'll be very cautious about reaching for that shock button and look at the rhythm longer and maybe default to not shocking as a rule. So we have to be very cautious about setting up behaviors that will transition over into the real world. And the way I like to teach it, the way I like to run, ALS teaching is, should our question be, much simpler than that? Not is it shockable or non-shockable, but why is this not a shockable rhythm? My default position is this is a shockable rhythm, and I look at the rhythm and go, why is that not shockable? Okay, that's not shockable. Yeah, but my default is always edging towards the safe. Yeah, and I think that's a much better mindset to apply to many things. Why shouldn't I do this? Yeah, this is the safe thing to do. Why shouldn't I do this? I think that also carries on to pediatrics. There's some quite well-known pediatric failed to shock cases that had a lot of publicity. And I think it's been repeated across the country as well. And there's been a pediatric rhythm dogma taught over the years that, shockable rhythms are very rare in children. It's going to be more likely asystolic, maybe PA. And that may also be reflected in our reality because a good proportion of pediatric cardiac arrests which are attended, bear in mind your average ambulance crew will go to a pediatric cardiac arrest every 12 years. Then, but a good number of the ones that are attended have often, sadly, been deceased for some time and have been found in the morning. Therefore, it sort of confirms what people have been taught, that the children will be found in a asystolic state or whatever. But when you actually look at the data about pediatric cardiac arrests, I think it varies across different studies, but in adults, you generally will find a shockable rhythm between 17 to 25% of out-of-hospital cardiac arrests, which seems about right to me. But it is very common to hear that they're very rare in pediatrics, and often you don't. It's not ran as scenarios. You get very few sort of, shockable pediatric arrest scenarios ran in education. But in this study, 4 to 8% of cases were shockable rhythms, and I've seen other studies that maybe reflected as high as 17%, so only a few percent lower than maybe where the adult average is. So it's really doing people a disservice if we teach them the wrong thing and teach them stuff that really just isn't true. I think that mindset has been around for quite a long time in my experience. So what can we do about this? How can we manage this problem? If we recognize and accept, we don't have to, but if we recognize and accept, that it is a problem, then, what can we do about it? Some services have done something about it already. Many have defaulted back to AED mode as the default position. And there either has to be another ambulance resource or an advanced resource in the form of some form of critical care or advanced paramedic on scene before they can go out of AED mode. And other services has to be sort of more than one paramedic there. But many have gone back to AED mode. And it's accepting in those services as well. They're using quite antiquated monitors that are really slow in AED mode. Yeah, they're slow to analyze and slow to charge. And the machines are quite old, so the batteries aren't very good, so they're quite slow to charge. And yet in those services, they still deem that to be safer than the risk of shocks not being delivered. Because in AED mode, even if it's slow, yeah, you will never get a fail to shock because the machines are pretty good. Anything that it thinks is shockable, it will shock. Yeah, and it also releases a lot of bandwidth. I was doing some ALS OSCEs with some second year student paramedics very recently that are very new to ALS, and they work for or they're linked to an ambulance service that only does AED mode. I did cardiac arrest with them for 2 days, and no one got a rhythm wrong. You couldn't deny that it wasn't helping, because every time I put a shockable rhythm of all different types, because I'll scroll through the thing and find, I've made different, variances of VF that I can. The machine every time would just go, yeah, I'm going to shock that. Yeah, so I think that possibly is does have a place, along with managing some of the sort of educational issues. Technology may be an answer. Yeah, now if you look at some of the newer machines, yeah, so most of my experience sits around using the Zolex series. You've got CPR feedback. If you've got the CPR pucks on, you've got see-through CPR. It doesn't work in every patient. Where it does work, it works really well when the puck's directly located and actually filters out the chest compression, so you can see the underlying rhythm. So you don't really need to stop to do a rhythm check because you can see what the underlying rhythm is, and you can see clearly if there's been a gross change in the rhythm, and then if you hit the analyze button, which you can see there, bottom center of the screen, then the Zol also knows shockable rhythm, because although it's sort of in manual mode, you can still select engines and press charge and whatever. But if you tap the analyze mode, it's already looking at the rhythm. In fact, it'll be shouting at you, going VF alert, VF alert, VF alert. If it sees VF, it actually tells you, in case you're not looking at the screen. So it's already actually pre-charging in the background. So it knows you want to probably shock this rhythm, so it starts to prep for it. And if you analyze, it does a very quick look, because it already knows what the underlying rhythm is in reality. And it's rated to deliver the shock in 3.6 seconds. So that's probably faster than we are. Yeah, I think all of us would struggle to recognize the rhythm, make sure we're at the right energy, press charge, and be ready to shock in 3.6 seconds. So advances in technology may lead to changes in practice, and I think that's important. Also, it does impedance adjustment, so it will change the shock level depending on the patient. Yeah, some are capable of doing that. So it's actually sending small shocks between the pads and measuring in impedance and adjusting itself, so it's able to cope with different size patients and possibly even pediatrics. And I believe there's new software waiting for approval that means it will even analyze the type of VF and decide when the most appropriate shock time is. So actually the 2-minute cycles could even go where the machine is looking at the shockable rhythms and going, not yet, yeah, not yet, not yet, not yet, now. Yeah, and sort of interpreting where we want to deliver the shock. So yeah, this is pretty fast, and it's so fast in getting to a shockable state in 3.6 seconds, you don't even have time to go back on the chest to do CPR. Because by the time you press analyze, it's already, it's ready to shock so fast. Someone's asking a question about pediatrics. Yeah, well, it depends on what machine you're using. Some have pediatric mode, and many do have pediatric AD mode, but it's not widely used in sort of many ALS settings. I was discussing this with someone quite recently and about whether this was appropriate. If you look at public access defibrillators, then they rarely have pediatric pads in them. So people are told to deliver defibrillation using the adult pads and the adult machine, because there's very little science around the full joules a kilo, and probably a greater risk in children being under defibrillated than over defibrillated. And if you've got a machine that can actually measure impedance and adjust the shock level accordingly, then I think, even AED made for pediatrics of most ages is probably relatively safe and maybe something that we can move to in the future. So probably, between 1 and 12 years, I think, AED mode is probably feasible and safe. And I say in public access AEDs, people are told to use it anyway, because early defibrillation of any type is better than no defibrillation. And of course, we can improve education. Yeah. And I think this is a great quote from Albert Einstein. Yeah, it'd be better if you only began to teach others only after you've learned something yourself. I think that's very, very true. We have a fast turnover workforce, and that's probably included in education as well. And we have some excellent educators, and they're very well-meaning. But certainly, I've been involved in some, had to attend some mandatory education last year, where I was taught by some lovely people about traumatic cardiac arrests, who openly admitted themselves that neither of them had ever been to a traumatic cardiac arrest. Yeah, and that's not a great educational model. I think we can probably all agree on that. Yeah, so clinical experience really needs to be there in education for people to deliver meaningful education, not just teach what they were taught or what it says in the book, because the book would have to be 1 million pages long to take into all the grey circumstances we have in pre-hospital care. So, in summary, probably always remember that not shocking what might be a shockable rhythm in normal circumstances has to be a clinically reasoned decision. Yeah, really our default should be towards defibrillation. Someone mentioned, if you shock someone thinking it's fine VF, but it's not, is it going to do any harm? Probably not. It's probably just eating a bit of your battery. As long as your machine has plenty of battery life, it's probably not doing any harm at all. There might be a little bit more off the chest time, but it's about measuring risk, isn't it? What is the greater risk of failing to deliver defibrillation, or shocking something that subsequently might turn out to not be a shockable rhythm? I think the greater risk is not delivering defibrillation. Shocking a non-shockable rhythm with little difference in pauses and CPR probably just uses battery life. Yeah, and the latter would never be intentional. We wouldn't intentionally shock a non-shockable rhythm, but it sure is goddamn safer after 2 seconds, or 2.5 seconds. We've got to make a decision than not delivering defibrillation, in my opinion.